to introduce another concept today, aggregate demand function. Aggregate demand function. We have already seen this Keynes theory in the form of flowchart. This is the Keynesian theory given in the form of flowchart. So, in the Keynesian model, output is determined mainly by aggregate demand. So, output is determined by aggregate demand. So, we must know what is aggregate demand function. Aggregate demand function or ADF. What is aggregate demand function? The aggregate demand is the amount of money which entrepreneurs expect to get by selling the output produced by the number of laborers employed. I will read it again. The aggregate demand is the amount of money which entrepreneurs expect to get by selling the output produced by the number of laborers employed. So, what do you understand from this? So, aggregate demand is the amount of money. Who is receiving the money? The entrepreneurs are receiving the money, or the entrepreneurs are receiving money. How do they receive the money? By selling the output produced. Who's helping them to produce these outputs? The laborers. So the aggregate demand is the amount of money which entrepreneurs expect, they are expecting to get. How do the entrepreneurs get the money? By selling the output. Who produces the output? Produced by the number of laborers employed. So the aggregate demand is the amount of money. Entrepreneurs are receiving an amount of money. How are they receiving the money? By selling the output. Who's helping them to produce these outputs? The laborers. So the aggregate demand is the amount of money which entrepreneurs expect to get by selling the output produced by the number of laborers employed. Therefore, it is the expected income. So, aggregate demand is the expected income or revenue from the sale of output at different levels of employment. Aggregate demand has the following four components. So, what are the components of aggregate demand? 1. Consumption demand. 2. Investment demand. 3. Government expenditure and net export. What is net export? Export minus import. So, who all demands goods? Consumption, the household, they need goods. Investment, the firms, for their investment purpose, they need goods. Government also spends, so government is also spending money. So that is called as government expenditure. Apart from that, you have the fourth sector, which is called the foreign trade, net export. What do you mean by net export? Export minus import is called as the net export. So these are the components of aggregate demand. So how many components are there in the aggregate demand? There are four components. What are the components of aggregate demand? 1. Consumption demand. 2. Investment demand. 3. Government expenditure. And fourth one is net export. Net export means export minus import. So aggregate demand can be given as C plus I plus G plus X minus M. So AD is equal to C plus I plus G plus X minus M. C consumption, I investment demand, G government expenditure, X minus M is export minus the import. So this is the definition or for the answer for the question, what do you mean by aggregate demand function? Or write a note on aggregate demand function. You have to write all these points. So now let us see a graph. Okay, now you have to carefully listen to me and you can see the cursor moving. Okay, so please follow the cursor. When I teach you, please follow the cursor because these diagrams should be drawn on a board. But I already have this diagram here. So please follow the laser pointer which I am using here. Okay, so aggregate demand function. So on the x-axis here we mark the employment and on the y-axis I have marked the aggregate demand. This yellow curve is called as the aggregate demand. Why does it slope upwards? Okay, so on the x-axis you mark the employment, on the y-axis you mark the aggregate demand. This is the origin, 0. Okay, I marked as O. The yellow curve is called as the aggregate demand. Okay, so look at the explanation now. So what does this figure explain? This figure gives the relationship between employment and aggregate demand. That's why we mark the employment on the x-axis, and on the y-axis we mark the aggregate demand. So this is a figure which gives the relationship between employment and aggregate demand. So in this figure, okay, as the aggregate demand increases or decreases with an increase or decrease in the volume of employment. Here if you see the aggregate demand, okay, the aggregate demand increases. When does the aggregate demand increase? As the level of employment increases. So at 0 level of employment, aggregate demand is also 0. It starts from the point 0. Now it is moving. So in case I mark 1 unit here, okay, on the x-axis if I mark 1 unit, on the y-axis is also 1 unit. So as the employment increases, the aggregate demand also increases. Can you see? Yes? It explains that aggregate demand increases or decreases with an increase or decrease in the volume of employment. So this point you have to remember. Aggregate demand increases as the employment increases and decreases as the level of employment declines. So this is the first point. The diagram explains that aggregate demand increases or decreases with an increase or decrease in the volume of employment. Next one, AD curve increases at an increasing rate. If you see here, it is increasing at an increasing rate. That's why it is very steep. Okay, it increases very fast. So at the initial stage, the AD curve increases at an increasing rate. So at the beginning, the AD curve increases at an increasing rate. Later on, what does it do? The AD curve is increasing only, but it is increasing at a very slow rate. Here it increased very steeply, but here what is happening? The AD curve is increasing at an increasing rate in the beginning, and then it is also increasing, but it is increasing at a decreasing rate. What do you mean by increasing at a decreasing rate? There is increase only. Okay, initially it was increasing faster. Now it is increasing, but the increasing rate is slower. The rate of increase is at a decreasing rate. It is not as fast as it was in the beginning. In the beginning, the increase is at an increasing rate. Here what is happening? It is increasing, but the rate of increase is at decreasing rate. This shows that as income increases, when income increase, okay, why does the income increase? Because there is an increase in the employment. Please understand this clearly. As the employment increases, the income also increases. As the employment increases, the income also increases. This shows that as income increases, owing to increase in employment, expenditure of the economy increases at a decreasing rate. Already last year we have seen this. Income increases and consumption also increases, but consumption does not increase at the same rate of income, because people try to save a few amount. Okay, whatever income I get, I do not spend. If I get 10,000, I spend 10,000. If I get 20,000, I spend 20,000. If I get 30,000, I spend 30,000. It is not like that. As my income increases, my demand also increases. But what do I do? When my income increases to 10,000, my demand will be for 8,000. When it increases to 20,000, my demand will be for 16,000. When my income increases to 30,000, maybe my demand will be 20,000. A part of my income is used for saving. So that is the case here. This shows that as income increases, owing to increase in employment, the expenditure of the economy increases. So when there is an increase in the employment, there is an increase in the income, and there is also an increase in the expenditure, but the expenditure of the economy increases at a decreasing rate. Hope you understood this clearly. Okay, as employment increases, your income increases, your demand also increases, but the expenditure does not increase as much as your income increases. The expenditure of the economy increases at a decreasing rate. Were you able to understand? So write a short note on aggregate demand function. If the question is asked, you have to draw this diagram. Then the figure explains that aggregate demand increases or decreases with an increase or decrease in the volume of employment. So if the employment increases, the aggregate demand increases. If the employment falls, the aggregate demand also falls. So AD curve increases at an increasing rate in the beginning. In the beginning, the AD curve increases very sharply. Then later on, it increases but at a decreasing rate. This shows that as income increases, why does the income increase? Owing to an increase in employment. The employment is increasing, so the income is also increasing. Expenditure of the economy also increases. There is an increase in the employment, so there is an increase in the income, and there is also an increase in the expenditure of the economy, but it increases at a decreasing rate. This third point, you read it 2 or 3 times for you to understand. This shows that an income increases owing to increase in employment. Expenditure of the economy increases at a decreasing rate. So this is about aggregate demand function. So what did we see today? One moment. So we started with John Maynard Keynes. The father of modern macroeconomics. Then a small note about John Maynard Keynes. Then the book written by John Maynard Keynes, Keynes' Theory of Employment and Income. John Maynard Keynes was a critic of the J.B. Say's law, or the classical economist view. He was a critic, or he criticized the classical economists. Then we saw effective demand. What is effective demand? Effective demand is the starting point. Okay, so effective demand is the starting point of Keynes' theory. Here, can you see this picture? First, he is having a thought of buying it. So first, he must have the desire. Effective demand means he must have the desire to buy. So he has a desire to buy a phone. Then later on, he must have the money. So he must be willing to buy, and he must have the money to buy. Then that is only called as effective demand. So effective demand is the starting point of Keynes' theory. It denotes money actually spent by the people on products of industry. So what is the effective demand? Effective demand means the consumer is willing, he is willing to buy, and he is able to buy. He has got the desire to buy, and at the same time, he has got the ability to buy. So this is only called as effective demand. Effective demand means the consumer is willing and he is able to purchase. There is another term, notional demand. Notional demand means simply you will have the desire, okay, but you will not have the ability to buy. That is called as notional demand. But this is effective demand. So there are two things. Effective demand means you must have the desire, at the same time you must be able to buy, the willingness and the ability. That is only called as effective demand. Notional demand means you will have the desire, but you will not have the ability. So effective demand denotes the money actually spent by the people on products of industry. Then we saw the Keynesian theory in the form of flowchart. Maybe I will take a picture of this and post it in the WhatsApp group, okay, for you to take it down. So this is the answer for question number 31. This is not in your textbook. I am repeatedly saying. So I will take a picture of this and post it and you can copy it. Then we saw aggregate demand function. Aggregate demand function. AD is equal to C plus I plus G plus X minus M. Lastly, we saw the aggregate demand function, the graph or the diagram depicting aggregate demand function. Hope you understood it, girls. Thanks for listening. Okay, you need to go through this video again and again to understand it easily. If you have any doubts, please post your questions in your WhatsApp group, in our WhatsApp group. Okay, if not, text me or give me a missed call and I will call you. Thank you, girls.